Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here to take a closer look at the new Sigma 24-70mm f2.8 DG OS HSM, and this is from their Art series. Now, I can tell from my first look episode that a lot of you are really interested in this lens, which of course is completely what I anticipated. Sigma's new Art series lenses really come with a lot of expectation from people because of strong optical performance from them at usually what comes down to as a very competitive price compared to alternatives. Today we're going to jump in and we're going to take a closer look at the image quality, the resolution from the lens, but also some of those other metrics. You know, how its color rendering is, how its bokeh quality is. We'll take a look even at some things like distortion, flare resistance, all of the different metrics that are a part of lens performance on the optical level. And so we're going to jump in and take a look together at some real-world images along with some controlled tests here. Okay, we'll start by taking a look just at sharpness. We're going to look at 24mm, 35mm, 50mm, and 70mm. And so here at f2.8 wide open, 24mm, we see that our center sharpness is pretty good here. Textures look fairly crisp, and I don't really see a lot of like softness of haze. Contrast is quite good. As we move out towards the edge of the frame, however, you can see at wide open apertures the image quality is degrading quite a bit, and we are much softer in the corners and compared to the center of the frame here, and particularly here you can see. And I would say, kind of looking at this too, that you can also see some of the barrel distortion pattern there, and also along the top curve here. But you know, it's not absolutely terrible either. Look at this line here, and it's still fairly straight. One other thing that you can see as a part of this, there might be a little bit of kind of field curvature or plane of focus, and so that may account for some of the softness towards the edges. If we stop down to f4, so I'll just kind of scroll back and forth there, you can see that there is a bit of vignette that clears up, and so look down here, f2.8, and then at f4, you can see that brightening up. In the center, you know, it's maybe a little bit crisper, but roughly the same. The improvement is really starting to stretch out towards the edges of the frame, and while it's still not, you know, razor sharp here on the edges, there's a little bit of less of that, you know, softness, haze that is there. Stopping on down to f5.6, you can see again, this is f4, f5.6, there's a little bit more vignette lift there. And so now we see center of the frame looks really good. And as we move out towards the edges, if not as sharp as the center, they are reasonably close. And so here is probably approaching, at least with a 5D Mark IV body. We basically reach as good as we're going to get before diffraction starts to become a factor. But let's step on down to f8. I'm going to scroll back and forth, and you'll see there is just a minuscule amount of vignette that is still lifted there from f5.6 to f8. So here at f8, in the center and across the frame, everything looks pretty good here, I would say. And so somewhere at, you know, f5.6, f8, if you're wanting to shoot landscapes, this is probably your optimal apertures here for that. Here's f11, and at f11, I wouldn't say that you're getting necessarily any more sharpness, and now diffraction is maybe causing just a tiny bit of softness, haze back into the equation, and so I would say f8 is your best bet. Now, if we move to 35mm, f2.8, we're going to find once again that our center sharpness is still pretty good, and looking out towards the edge, it seems like the edge, you know, is not as sharp, but it's certainly not as soft as what f2.8 at 24mm was. So if we look over here at the difference between, this is 24mm, this is 35mm, you can see that there is a pretty marked improvement in, you know, edge-to-edge sharpness at 35mm compared to 24. Now, look here, like along the edges going from f2.8 to f4, you can see that there is a little bit of a vignette lift, but here at 35mm, the vignette is less pronounced anyway. And so at f4, our edges are now looking quite good. The center looks excellent, of course. I really like the look right here, and out towards this edge also looks good. Moving to f5.6, I do see, I'm going to toggle back and forth here, an extremely minute difference in terms of vignette. So vignette at 35 millimeters is really not much of a factor at any aperture. Certainly not enough to impact you at field use. f5.6, we're seeing a nice crisp result from corner to corner. And we'll just go down to f8 here. And at f8, you know, I think it's pretty much more of the same. I don't know that I'm seeing more sharpness, but certainly our sharpness is right out to the very edge of the frame. And so a nice result there. Now, if we move to 50 millimeters here, we're going to take a look at our center once again. Center is very consistently looking good. And out towards the edge of the frame, you know, the edge is not looking too bad here at 50 millimeters. In fact, if I put them side by side here at 35 millimeters, which was an improvement over 24 millimeters, I would say that 50 millimeters is an even further improvement in terms of edge sharpness at wide open at f2.8. And so you can see there's just a little bit more detail and contrast at 50 millimeters than there was at 35 millimeters, which of course was significantly better than it was at 24 millimeters. At 50 millimeters from f2.8 to f4, you see a tiny bit of brightening, and then f5.6, just a tiny bit more. But once again, vignette, not a huge factor here at these focal lengths. At f4 here in the center, this is, I think, the best sharpness and contrast that I've seen from the lens. That's a great looking result there. And also right out towards the edges, you know, looking quite good here at f4. Let's stop down to f5.6, and you can see just a little bit more contrast and resolution that came into those corners. However, the center remains, you know, pretty much equal. You see a little bit more improvement along the edge. And then f8 doesn't look like it's really making much of a difference. At 50 millimeters, I would say f4 to f5.6 is your top. f8 is about the same, but no real improvement. So use that more for depth of field than you would for trying to add more sharpness. Finally, at 70 millimeters, we can see, looking into the center of the frame, that our center frame once again looks quite good. And moving out to the edge, I would say we're a little bit of a step back from 50 millimeters in terms of sharpness there, maybe a little bit closer to the 35 millimeter result. And but I would say still better than the 24 millimeter result. Let's take a look at vignette here. So if we move up to f4, you can see, toggling back and forth, there's a pretty significant difference. And so unsurprisingly, the 24 and 70 millimeter positions are the ones most impacted by vignette. Moving up to f5.6 brightens things up a little bit, but most of your improvement is between f2.8 and f4. Back at f4 here in terms of our sharpness. Center sharpness at f4 looks great, good contrast, and looking towards the edge of the frame. We still have a bit of a softness towards the edge of the frame. You can just see, you know, details aren't quite as crisply rendered. There's a little bit of haze there. Stopping down to f5.6, and at f5.6, you know, still it still isn't great towards the edges of the frame, and so in the center things look fine. Finally at f8 here, and at f8 our result is maybe a bit improved, but it never gets as crisp as it does at 50 millimeters at any aperture here at 70 millimeters. Center sharpness is excellent, but you know, a corner sharpness not so great. Now I want to just take a look at more of a landscape type image here, and so this is at f2.8, and we'll just take a quick look at the details. I would say that, you know, you're rendering plenty of detail there along frame, and so right out to the very edge we see that edge softness that we talked about a bit. This is at 32 millimeters here, and so not, you know, somewhere in between the improvement at 35 millimeters and the weaker 24 millimeter performance out towards the edge. Stopping down to f4, you can see that, vignette really wasn't a huge factor, didn't change a whole lot. Detail all throughout this area is nice and crisp, and now that corner is a little bit better, and this corner, also looks fine. I would have no issues in using that. f5.6, a little tiny uptick in corner brightness, and maybe a little uptick here in terms of our detail rendered, all of which is good. And now right out to the edge of that frame, that looks good. On this side, also looks good. And finally at f8, no real change in terms of vignette, and in terms of our detail, we're looking at roughly the same, which, frankly, this is quite good. And so I would have no issues in using this for landscape purposes. You stop the lens down and it does a great job. Now, even at what we perceive as the weakest, in terms of edge performance, 24 millimeter, but then at 70 millimeters, we saw a little bit softer towards the edges. But in terms of, what you're going to most likely use this for, I would say that that is a beautiful amount of detail, but more importantly, I'm really impressed with the rendering from this lens. Bokeh quality is really nice and soft here, and here's another shot, and it shows you, again, the same kind of nice detail. But look at this. Let's look at this crop here. This is 70 millimeters f2.8, and fine detail is really actually nicely rendered there, and just the rendering as you go towards defocus, I'm quite impressed with. I'm not often blown away by bokeh quality from Sigma art lenses, but this one I really do like. Now, some of you looking at this image in my gallery, a couple of you said I see some onion type bokeh there, and certainly here there's a little bit of it evident, but it's certainly not strongly pronounced. And I've shot a lot of images like this with a lot of different lenses, and this really is not worst case scenario at all to me. And in fact, the quality of the bokeh is really, to me, quite pleasing in terms of the highlights. Now here's kind of stop down, just looking at detail and color rendition, and again, stop down. Just in real world use, that looks, nice to me. I'm very happy to use that as like a traveled type lens, although it's on the heavier side, but, great color rendition. Here's a, shot. This is around 70 millimeters. And so here you can see some areas that trend a little bit towards busyness, but overall the rendering there is nice and soft, and skin textures are certainly good enough. And, here we've got my self-portrait in her sunglasses, but you can see in the plane of focus here that the detail looks quite good, and look at the nice soft background and really good color rendition. And here's my wife getting a self-portrait, taking a picture of me. Again, looking at the background, I find that all to be very pleasing in terms of the rendering. How about some food? Looking at these tacos, this is kind of just looking at this as a travel lens, general purpose. Again, it's a great looking image, and they had, at this place, they had homemade ice cream sandwiches, and as you can see, that looks pretty yummy here in all of the details there. Here, once again, just kind of a more a defocus type look, and this is actually at f4, but we can see that everything is rendered nicely here. And in this image, where there is certainly potential for chromatic aberrations, I'm not seeing a lot of them, and so CA is really handled quite well here. Just a tiny bit of fringing along these edges, but not enough to really negatively impact an image. Once again, bokeh rendering even at this kind of, not medium distance, but also not at, near macro type focus distances. So there's nice detail there, but all of this in here that could trend towards, really busy it's handled quite nicely. And as you get a little bit closer here, you can see that the bokeh performance here is really quite lovely. This is actually APS-C here. I'm using it on an adapter on a Sony A6500 body, and so as you can see, a really nice result. Here's a look at the sunburst, which is fine from the image, but you will also note that it does have a tendency to produce some ghosting, and a little bit of veiling here. The veiling isn't bad, but there definitely is a ghosting pattern if you get the sun in the frame. Here's another example here. And so, up in this particular corner, it's, that's okay. There's a little bit of prismatic haze, but I'm more concerned, kind of down in this area where you're getting some kind of ghosting blobs. And so I'm never really a fan of that and trying to clean that up in post. Back to some positives here, though. I'm really impressed by the color rendition out of this lens and the basic rendering from it. I think that this is an unusually good Sigma lens in terms of color rendition, and this is a straight out of camera image, and I think I raised some of the white levels a little bit. And this is a blue hour shot, but I mean, I just really love that color rendition. And then here, just kind of a family type shot, but you can see, nice detail where you want nice detail, and then a nice transition to defocus, and the color rendition is what it should be in this kind of shot. So as you can see, this is a somewhat atypical Sigma Art Series lenses, many of which have been known for having very close to, if not class-leading, resolution performance. And sometimes I find that comes at a cost in some other areas. Maybe they're a little bit clinical in their rendering with bokeh quality that is okay but not exceptional, or sometimes I find the colors to be a little bit flatter maybe than what I would like. Things like that. Not as much contrast as what I would like. But this is kind of the opposite of all of those things. I find actually that the color rendering is exceptional, and better, I think, than any of the 2470 options that I've used previously. I really like the contrast out of the box, and I find that the bokeh quality is really quite pleasing for a lens like this, a zoom lens like this. I think that it does a great job in these various metrics of rendering. It is a little bit flare prone, as you can see, but that's not necessarily atypical there either. But of course, where it isn't necessarily exceptional, it is good but not exceptional, and that is actually in the resolution. And it is quite strong at the 35 and 50 millimeter points, but at 24 millimeters and at 70 millimeters, it's fine in the middle, but a little softer towards the edges of the frame, and really not exceptional at any aperture on the edges of the frame. And so it's a different kind of approach, and I'll have to tell you that for me personally, I'm more drawn to this lens than I am of some of the supremely sharp Sigma Art options. And because I find that the overall package, the actual images themselves, and that's what matters to me, the images themselves look good. Whether I process them or not, they come out of the camera looking really good, and the thing is that the lens is sharp enough. And I think for most applications, there's plenty of sharpness for most users. And so I personally applaud the approach that Sigma has taken with this lens myself. Now, stay posted, because in my final review, my final verdict, I'm going to be delving into that a little bit more deeply. I'll also take a look at a few of the other things, the optical stabilizer, autofocus performance, and maybe in the fall, when I've got more time, I may try to throw together, and once the Tamron 24-70 G2 is actually released in a Canon mount, it's out in Nikon, but it's delayed in a Canon mount. Once that's actually out, I may try to put together more of a head-to-head and maybe get a Canon 24-70 f2.8L Mark II in there, just, for another variable, and, throw it all into the mix at that point. In the meantime, you can look down in my description down below, and you can find linkage to my image gallery that I've been contributing to along the way. You can also, of course, become one of my patrons or follow me on social media. And thanks to those of you that have become supporters. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.